Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with Emma, who I just met earlier today. We were on a panel this morning. Hopefully I will not repeat any questions that she was already asked. But I'm very happy that you're in New Orleans, your first time in the city.
Yes.
So hopefully y'all will ask her some questions at the end about her experience thus far. I'll give a brief introduction, and then Emma will read a little bit from the book. Emma Cline is the author of The Girls, the story collection Daddy, and her most recent novel, The Guest. The Girls was a finalist for a National Book Critics Circle Award, the First Novel Prize, and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and was the winner of the Shirley Jackson Award. Her stories and essays have appeared in The New Yorker, the Paris Review, the New York Times, Granta, and the Best American Short Stories. She also has an alter ego as a publisher. She helps curate a series of publications for the Gagosian Gallery that pairs writers with artists, which I think is such a beautiful way of enriching the literary world. So thank you for doing that. All right, Emma, take us away.
Thank you so much, Katie. I'm so happy to be here in this balmy New Orleans day.
Oh, it's hard to hear?
Okay.
We're going to get even closer to our microphone.
Hopefully this is better. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the very beginning of The Guest. This was August. The ocean was warm and warmer every day. Alex waited for a set to finish before making her way into the water, slogging through until it was deep enough to dive. A bout of strong swimming and she was out, beyond the break. The surface was calm. From here, the sand was immaculate. The light, the famous light, made it all look honeyed and mild. The dark European green of the scrub trees, the dune grasses that moved in whispery unison, the cars in the parking lot, even the seagulls swarming a trash can. On the shore, the towels were occupied by placid beachgoers. A man, tanned to the color of expensive luggage, let out a yawn. A young mother watched her children run back and forth to the waterline. What would they see if they looked at Alex? In the water, she was just like everyone else. Nothing strange about a young woman swimming alone. No way to tell whether she belonged here or didn't. When Simon had first taken her to the beach, he'd kicked off his shoes at the entrance. Everyone did, apparently. There were shoes and sandals piled up by the low wood railing. No one takes them? Alex asked. Simon raised his eyebrows. Who would take someone's shoes? But that had been Alex's immediate thought, how easy it would be to take things out here, all sorts of things. The bikes leaning against the fence, the bags unattended on towels, the cars left unlocked, no one wanting to carry their keys on the beach, a system that existed only because everyone believed they were among people like themselves. Before Alex left for the beach, she had swallowed one of Simon's painkillers, a leftover from a long ago back surgery, and already the familiar mental gauze had descended, the surrounding salt water another narcotic. Her heart beat pleasantly, noticeably, in her chest. Why did being in the ocean make you feel like such a good human? She floated on her back, her body moving a little in the push and pull, her eyes closed against the sun. There was a party tonight, hosted by one of Simon's friends, or a business friend. All his friends were business friends. Until then, hours to waste. Simon would be working the rest of the day. Alex left to her own devices, as she had been ever since they'd come out here, almost 2 weeks now. She hadn't minded. She'd gone to the beach nearly every day, worked through Simon's painkiller stash at a steady but undetectable pace, or so she hoped, and ignored Dom's increasingly unhinged texts, which was easy enough to do. He had no idea where she was. She tried blocking his number, but he got through with new ones. She would change her number as soon as she got the chance. Dom had sent another jag that morning. Alex, answer me. Even if the texts still caused a lurch in her stomach, She had only to look up from the phone, and it all seemed manageable. She was in Simon's house, the windows open onto pure green. Dom was in another sphere, one she could pretend no longer quite existed.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So we're here mostly to talk about your most recent novel, The Guest, which follows the misadventures of this girl named Alex, who has found herself kicked out of a very cushy situation with this pseudo lover in the Hamptons, and is having to survive there for about a week without any resources other than her wits. And I think of it as a kind of battle of young womanhood versus the world. But I want to start with a question that kind of addresses all of your books, which is the performance of femininity, which is a staple of young womanhood. You explore it in The Girls and you explore it in The Guest. And you have a remarkable line in this book as one of the characters is explaining to Alex how to recognize other sex workers in public based on their shade of lipstick or the kind of dress they're wearing. She describes them as girls in drag as girls. How did you learn growing up what it meant to perform womanhood, and what of that felt natural to you and what of it felt foreign?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm sure, men must feel these things too, boys growing up. But maybe it's codified in such a strange way for girls, that you would encounter a magazine that would have 10 tips on how to kiss or how to do your makeup or how to look. Like it's so overt in this way. And I think anybody growing up, you're kind of looking to the world for information about how to be and I'm the oldest I have 4 younger sisters, when we're all really close in age. So there were a lot of teenage girls in my house at the same time. And just like the absolute virgin suicide style, no suicides, thankfully, but just scrum of young girls kind of learning how to be in the world, I think really made a big impression on me. And I think almost just in the way you can't quite choose what your subjects are, they kind of are mysteriously lodged inside you. Something about that time period and just really that strangeness of understanding that it was a performance or that it required a certain costume or affect really stuck with me and is something I obviously kind of circle around again and again in fiction.
And so as the oldest, how much did you have a role in conveying that to your younger sisters?
Yeah, definitely. Because you are the oldest. I don't know what they would say, whether it was good or bad. At least we were kind of out in the middle of nowhere, so everything was modulated a bit. We didn't get the full on, growing up in LA or something version of that. But yeah, I think the dynamic between women is really interesting to me. And that was obviously dynamics I had growing up with these 4 younger sisters. And I think, in some way, someone was like, what do you write about? And I was kind of like, women's lives. That's, I think, what I'll always be interested in.
Yeah. And does it feel like when you're writing your fictional characters, it's a way for you, it's a helpful way for you to unpack that manufactured identity of womanhood?
Yeah, I don't know if I think of it as that one-to-one, I'm unpacking something. I think so much of writing, and maybe you experience this too when you're writing fiction, but it's almost like a dream state when it's going well, intermittently. But, it's so mysterious. You're kind of being carried along by forces that you can't quite explain. So, I don't even know, am I dismantling my received knowledge about how to be a woman? Probably not. Like I'm probably just like entrenching it in some way. But it's definitely, that's like the inputs that I have to work with.
Yeah.
You know?
I sometimes think of it like the way we played with dolls when we were little, sort of giving stories to these false humans is kind of the same thing that we do when we write fiction. It's just like imaginary, invisible dolls that we're working with. Yeah.
And there's something, I think there is some part of it where you just almost can't see yourself doing it. Like you can't fully know why you're drawn to the things you're drawn to. And maybe, do you feel that way when you're like writing a novel? Like why this subject? Like,
it's very much after the fact when you're talking to readers or like on a panel and they're like, well, you know, tell us about your inspiration for this. And you're like, oh, that's probably where it came from.
Yeah, and you can start to like psychologize. Mm-hmm. Or sometimes it's like a review will start to eerily sound like my therapist. I'm like, oh no. Like I thought I've hidden all this stuff so well, but actually it's all
right on
there.
the page. Yeah. Another question I have is about the tilting power dynamics in this novel, which one thing that's so fascinating to me about the character of Alex is that she has two like things working against her, which is that she's young, so no one takes her seriously, and she's a woman, so no one takes her seriously. But she also has two sources of power, one of which is her youth, and one of which is being a woman. So she is able to manipulate the assumptions and expectations of people around her through flirting, through seduction, through playing innocent, in such a way that she is using those weaknesses against the people who are trying to put her in her place or deny her in some way. And so I'm curious whether you see her fundamentally as a powerful character or as a victim or both, or are those categories inherently flawed?
Yeah. So my first novel, The Girls, had a narrator who was 14 years old. And then part of the book was her as a middle-aged woman, kind of looking back. But writing this character, and it was first person too, so you're kind of, at least writing it, you know, I was very much in the mindset of this, how it felt to be 14. Spoiler, not that great. Like it felt pretty awful. And yeah, to be a 14-year-old girl, I think is to lack so much agency and so much power. And I think thinking about this character and writing this book, I really wanted to write a character who did have a lot of agency, and who did have more power, and at least nominally or to herself believes that she's acting on the world and not just allowing the world to act on her. I mean, whether or not that's actually true, whether her power is real or just kind of, you know, soft power that exists in very particular circumstances, I don't know. But yeah, it was definitely kind of a reaction against the girls almost. And yeah, wanting to write a different kind of character.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting to see them living in the same world, and having such different responses to the stimuli, all the things that they're absorbing around them. Yeah. I'm just curious, is there like a third version of being a woman in the world that you're going to explore?
I mean, it's funny. The book I'm working on, I don't know, maybe you do this too, but I find that working on like multiple book projects at the same time is a way to kind of trick myself out of getting too like anxious about any one, so you can always kind of switch over to the other one. And one of the two that I'm working on now is set at the Playboy Mansion.
Oh my
Which
gosh.
I feel like in some ways it's like Charles Manson called like, you know, con artist in the Hamptons, like Playboy Mansion. It might be this like trilogy.
Yeah, totally.
Of like womanhood. But for whatever reason, I really am drawn to these extremes where the performance is made so visible.
Yeah.
Like I can't think of an environment, you know, that's more explicated as like, okay, what is your worth as a young woman than the Playboy Mansion, where it was dictated exactly what shade of hair dye your like blonde hair would be. And you were kind of the mascot for this team that for a sport you didn't play. Kind of like there's just something so strange and fairy tale haunted about it. Like they had a 9 p.m. curfew. These, 26-year-old women had to be home at the Playboy Mansion by 9. And they were locked away for the night. And just thinking of the pure hours, number of hours and life hours and years of these women's lives that were kind of spent locked away.
It's a fairy tale.
Yeah, I can't get over it. Yeah.
It makes me think of one of the scenes in The Guest where Alex is in the house of someone very wealthy, and she sees this painting that is clearly like a famous painting. Like she recognizes it, and she asks to touch it. And the guy's like, "Oh, I don't know if that's a great idea." She's like, "I'm just going to touch it." And of course she makes this tiny scratch in it. And it makes me think about like that as like a facade of, it's so valuable because it is recognizable. And like she sees it as like, oh, this is something that's worth millions of dollars. And it's yet so easy to damage.
Yeah.
Like it feels like that's a metaphor for the women too.
Yeah, definitely. Or just like, what is value and how is that decided on, and like what's the pageantry around it? And like just because I'm so deep in Playboy Mansion research right now, just like how shabby it was, like molding carpets and like dog poop everywhere from like everyone's little dogs, and just like sun bleached curtains, and all the art was fake, like imitation art. It just feels so, I don't know, I love it.
Like a stage set.
Yeah. Exactly.
So this makes me wonder about the question of like your affection for your characters or your love for your characters. There's a really interesting moment too in The Guest where Alex is hanging out with a friend who seems to have it all. She has a house, she has a family, she has money, but she's really lonely. And the narrator says, "Why should Alex pity her? She would trundle forth into her future." Which makes me wonder who you have pity for as a novelist. Do you try to withhold judgment of your characters?
Yeah, pity. I guess I find that it's not a helpful place to write from.
Yeah.
Like any kind of moral judgment. A lot of people have thoughts like, is Alex a good person or bad person? Like, I encounter that a lot. And it's almost like something I didn't even think about as, maybe that sounds silly to be like, I wrote an entire book about a character without really thinking, is this person good or bad? But it just doesn't almost feel like my business. Like I just want to get inside the guts of her like consciousness and move her along. And yeah, it's not really for me to say. And yeah, I mentioned this earlier in our panel, but I wrote this short story from the point of view of Harvey Weinstein, like the day before he was sentenced, because I just wanted, like, what was 24 hours in Harvey Weinstein's mind? Like, what does that look like? What does it feel like? You can't be a monster 24 hours a day. Like, Harvey must be hungry sometimes. Like, I think I'd read a New York Times article and it said he was, under house arrest and he was Googling himself a lot. And that just immediately was just like, oh, he's having this like awkward human experience. Like I can understand that. That's like an entry point. Like just from that, you have to be able, I think, or this is the writing I like, the books I like to read. It's like really dismantling someone's consciousness. And as a writer, kind of deciding like no human experience is going to be like too much for me or alien. I need to accept that, like, some part of you can withhold judgment, I think.
Yeah. Have you read the Eudora Welty short story, Where is the Voice Coming From?
No.
So she does a similar thing. She enters the mind of Byron D. Beckwith, who assassinated Medgar Evers. And she wrote it I think the week that Medgar Evers was shot and killed in Jackson, Mississippi. And published it in the New Yorker. And it's a very short, 4 to 5 page story entirely in the guy's head. And she just wanted to know what it felt like to be someone who really thought that, blacks were trying to overturn the world and he had to go out and kill some of them. And like just the idea of her, like as a white woman in Mississippi writing this, without I mean, like, clearly she had judgment. Like, we can, like,
Right.
judge Harvey Weinstein, but also, like, the job of a writer is to burrow into
Yeah.
what is human about them.
I think that's always, I mean, just even the girls really came out of, so I grew up in California, and the Manson family, like that whole story was really alive still. And, you know, I'd read Helter Skelter, all the books, I'd read all the articles, but it never answered the questions that I wanted answered, which was like, really, okay, how did these 17-year-old girls, how did they go from being like a homecoming queen to, you know, being part of this weird murder in the Hollywood Hills? Like, nobody was answering that question. And I feel like that's what fiction does really well is, you know, kind of you get to answer or try to answer those kinds of questions. Like, what does it look like inside the mind of another human being?
Mm-hmm.
And that's like so beautiful and special.
Yeah. Yeah, there's like a godlike quality to what we do. And there are people who see God as a very, you know, judgmental force in the world, and others who see him as just like a creator who made things and stepped away. And yeah, you have a quote from, I think, your interview with Harper's about fiction as being an almost amoral space where you can work things out. And I'm wondering along these lines if you think that life itself is essentially amoral, or is fiction supposed to have a meaning that life does not, or vice versa?
The meaning of life. I didn't know we'd
We're
get
going
into
deep,
that
guys.
on the American Airlines stage or whatever. I guess, I mean, maybe the more I read fiction and the more I write fiction, the less I believe in narrative, and the less I see narrative in my life and the lives of the people around me. Like, I see the impulse for narrative. I see our desire to tell stories and our desire for the neatness of an ending or a moral. I think a lot of politics is basically like good guy, bad guy storytelling. And I think it's really alluring, and it can be this incredibly powerful narcotic. But I think, like, actually life really resists any kind of easy story or moral or meaning. Yeah, I don't know. It has kind of changed the way I write fiction. Just because, like, yeah, I kind of want to hold both things. Like, obviously I'm a reader. Like, I love disappearing into a book. Like, I love the narrative impulse, but I also want some of what is so confusing and strange about life and the way, you know, it does resist a neatness or, you know, a tidy moral imperative. Yeah.
So you want that reflected in the books that you write?
Yeah, I think I like the messiness and that maybe you could end a book and no one's a hero or no one's changed. I don't know about you guys, but I don't know a lot of people who really change that much, including myself. Even though that's, like, again, such an appealing narrative, and it's such an appealing idea that, like, oh, well, I'm going to be a different person, like New Year's resolutions. It's like such a classic thing, but just, I don't know. I'm touched by the impulse and the desire, but I also am interested in the ways, like, it falls short, or, yeah, everyone's, like, petty humanness. I don't know. It moves me.
Yeah. So in terms of, like, what compels you to write fiction, to tell stories, even if they are non-narrative, resisting narrative, you write so much about gender and power. Your story collection, Daddies, is a number of the stories are told from the point of view of older men who are sort of either getting their comeuppance or not, as the case may be. And I feel like, at least for me, so much of my writing is a way to, like, exercise my own demons. And so I'm wondering, through writing these characters, both the young women and the older men, are you, like, how is your perspective around gender changed in the world? Like, does the act of writing make you feel more empowered, more in control, or does it make you more jaded and cynical about the state of the world?
Yeah. You know, again, it's like I almost don't... Writing kind of operates in such a weird other world for me where I almost don't feel like it, I don't know, like, does it affect how I feel about gender? I don't know. It's so automatic is the wrong word. It's more like subterranean. Like it's coming from some place inside of you that's not quite conscious. So hopefully, like, you can get it out in some way. But I don't know that it translates into me having like any clear or like intelligent thoughts about gender. You know, I mean, I just think so much of writing, and I think in your work you could see this too. It's like it is that noticing the world around you, you know, observation, details, somebody who's interested in what the texture of life is. And then in terms of like where it goes after that, I feel like that's almost not my job. It's like my job to paint the picture, but not like talk about what the picture's about in some way. Just because I'm not smart enough to do it, or that's beyond my knowing. Like I'm so impressed / terrified of the idea of people who write like opinion columns. Just the idea of having any solid opinion of the world and that being your job to kind of really digest the world and pop out these little gems of, you know, how things are. Like I think fiction kind of flourishes in the not knowing and the uncertainty and kind of just that space of observation.
Yeah, but also like fiction writing is a way of expressing opinion too. It's just like a much more like amorphous gray area opinion sphere.
Yeah. And maybe what I'm saying is like whatever I'm expressing is kind of unknown to me, even though it might be so obvious / maybe is if you zoom out and like look at my work. But yeah, I think at the time I'm just following what is interesting to me, or like little scenes that have some spark, or, you know, why do I want to write about this place? Like something, I want to write an image, you know, you want to bring it to life in some way.
Yeah, I think for me, like the act of putting that on page, of translating whatever it is I'm noticing into the things that the characters are noticing, gives me a small feeling of power.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you're the same in terms of like introversion and feeling kind of on the exterior of life in a way. But certainly growing up, I always struggled to find a voice. And fiction was a way to talk ad nauseum, 300 pages, and no one is interrupting you. And all of your thoughts and feelings about the universe can just be poured into this world that you have created. And then at the end of it, you can kind of like, that's done. And it's, again, as you said, not really your job to interpret it. That's the reader's job if you're lucky enough to have readers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely think growing up, I'm one of 7 kids. My mom had 7 kids in 10 years, which is really
I just had
wild.
one last year, and I'm like, I can't do anymore. It's so hard.
And I think growing up with so many other human beings around you with their own full internal worlds and universes, like it was just so many people up against each other. Like reading was really a place to go and be alone, and have your own like psychic space. And I do think probably writing came out of that. Being able to create a world that was yours.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about sort of craft and process stuff. One of the things that the guest does so well is manufacture this suspense that carries you page by page. Usually I'm someone who likes to space out my books and my reading. And this is one of the few books that I read in a day because I couldn't put it down. Even though on the face of it, nothing really happens. And so there's like a very impressive mastery there that I'm really curious about. Partly it stems from the disparity between the environment. You have this lush place, the Hamptons, that's filled with, you know, economic resources. And then you have this young woman who doesn't have, very briefly, she doesn't have home or money or a functioning cell phone. So you think, how is the environment and the protagonist, how are they going to reconcile? And you've talked about some of your influences, John Cheever's short story, The Swimmer, which is wonderful. I can see so much of it sort of in here. And also Patricia Highsmith's The Talented Mr. Ripley. So I'm curious if you could talk about the lessons you learned, either from them or other inspirations, about how to put suspense on the page in kind of unexpected ways.
Yeah, I think if you are going to write literary fiction and kind of with this book decide, okay, we're going to really be in this character's head and not that much is going to happen, like how am I going to respect a reader's time and attention? How am I going to like court it effectively? And for me, a lot of that comes from limitations that I give myself as the writer. So, I mean, one really like basic limitation is like a ticking clock. So in this novel, it's set over a very specific time span. There's a party coming up, like the party's coming up. The reader hopefully feels this ticking clock on the edge of the page. And then also kind of what are the ways to tighten the screws on this character? What are the ways to kind of throw problems in front of them? And so her cell phone not working, immediately that cuts off a whole area of, possible plot. So just kind of figuring out ways to kind of hinder yourself productively. And then sometimes it can be, I tried to think of each chapter as its own short story, kind of, and see if I could have some of that tension that I like in a short story, see if I could keep it over the span of a novel. And then, giving myself almost little Easter eggs or little fun things. Like you mentioned, The Swimmer, this short story that I love by John Cheever, where this man is swimming from pool to pool, backyard pool in Connecticut. And so I just decided, okay, in every chapter, she's going to like get in a body of water. She's going to get in a pool. She's going to get in the ocean. Like that's going to be like this little anchor I can give myself. And just like that, having that kind of really blunt plot device like works well for me.
And every pool is a little different. Like some she's like, do I really want to get in this pool? Like, I guess. Yeah.
But like sometimes it is just like that silly of like it's like, how are you going to trick yourself into, I don't know, having a hanger on which to, drape this consciousness.
Yeah. And you talk about courting the reader, which I love because that's something that I struggle with a lot, is like figuring out how to not just entertain myself, but to like make a work accessible for people who are coming at it from various different standpoints with different amounts of time on their hand to engage in this crazy world that I've created. Has that been something that you've had to teach yourself to do over time, or has that been sort of instinctual for you?
I feel sometimes like one unexpected positive thing for my writing life has been just to read a lot of garbage. Like just the most...
Like what qualifies as
like
garbage?
The Daily Mail. I don't know any Daily Mail readers in here. Just like the absolute schlockiest schlock. Or just like, trashy celebrity memoirs. A lot of good Playboy Bunny memoirs out there. Groupie memoirs. Just like kind of things that are all, you're not going to them for like the deep consciousness or, the sensibility or the prose. Like you're going to like touch some extreme of our human experience that's pretty compelling. And I grew up reading like the National Enquirer. You read Eudora Welty, I read the National Enquirer.
And here we are together.
But like there was just something, I do feel like it's so operatic, like the vision of humanity that those like really extreme stories offer. And I do think there's some lesson there for me anyways, or I'm getting something out of that really extreme quality of, I don't know, why are we so drawn to it? Why do we want to know, this? Why does the Daily Mail somehow have access to the worst things that have happened on planet Earth this day. Like there's something about the human drama that's so compelling to me. And I think kind of just naturally applying like a more literary, hopefully, well, whatever, mindset to these situations that you might, it's like a sex worker. Okay, I could see a version of that where you're not really taking this character seriously, maybe as a person, or the Manson girls, or something like that. Like there's the Daily Mail version, but then these are people like living their lives. Like that's where I have found my interest naturally goes, and I think there is something there that, yeah, like if I'm so interested in it, I believe that other people will be too.
Yeah, that makes so much sense to me. Like I have a weakness for reality TV, and my partner's always like, "Why are you watching this?" And I'm like, addicted to human drama because that is what we do. Like that's our trade. And it's like, I don't know, it's like going to the meat market and like seeing the raw like flanks hanging up or whatever. Like we get to take that and then like turn it into a dish that hopefully has slightly more nutritional value. My last question for you before I open it up to y'all, you have really interesting side hustles in the art world and the film world. And so I'm curious what else inspires you? What's going on in the world right now that is sort of firing your creative synapses?
Yeah, besides the Daily Mail page, which I've really been plugging. I find the art world to be like a totally different like environment than the literary world, and artists to be almost like another species of human being to me. Like I think that maybe it's because everyone knows how to write. Like we all write in our daily lives to some extent. We all have computers and we're all kind of dicking away. But then artists get to really almost occupy this other space entirely with their own specific tools. And there's like a certain freedom that I'm really drawn to. And it's just so fun to be around them. I think I'm always interested in anyone who's kind of making extreme choices about how they're living their lives. Just like any kind of choice that brings them outside of the accepted script, or people who have to kind of take responsibility for how their life is going to look and really, I don't know, motor it along just by their own ambition. That stuff's really interesting to me. And then just, the art world is also so extreme. Just the amount of money involved is like really mind-blowing. Like that really the art world is like 300 people, where we write books and like hopefully maybe it will be in an airport bookstore. Like we want everyone to read it maybe. But the art world is like, no, we want 10 people to see this painting. Like it's so, I don't know, that just any closed environment with its own rules and uniforms and codes and symbols. Like I'm always really into that.
Yeah, totally. We have time for a couple of questions. We don't have microphone stands, but if you stand up and yell it really loud, then I can repeat your question for Emma. I know it takes a lot of courage to ask the first question. Yes.
I hope they're not your friends anymore. Oh, I mean, I think you've totally hit it, and that is kind of this haunting experience. I just noticed it. God, I was at a party, and it it was an art world party. And just kind of everyone would look at the women and but their eyes would kind of go soft, and it would just be like men looking around for other men, and like you'd see their eyes kind of like dip over the women, like the wives, or, and it's something I still see happening. And I don't know. I think with Alex, it was thinking about, what you said too. It's like, could there be a character who is in some ways so disenfranchised, but is using that invisibility for her own ends, hopefully in an interesting way? Like, there is something that you can get a strange power out of being invisible. You can see things that people, don't want you to see because they almost don't recognize you as like a full human being. Like, they'll say things in front of you that they wouldn't say if they thought you were like a fully operating consciousness. So there's a strange power that can come with that. And I think with Alex, I was thinking about, what would that look like? Thanks.
Yes.
Yeah, a lot of this book, the editing process, it was different than my first book. I think with this, it was a lot about kind of messing around with what the parameters of the world were. So it was like there was a version of this where there was like more backstory for this character, just because I think it's like you're trying to fill up time or distract yourself. So you're like, okay, I'm going to rewrite it, but just with some more backstory now. And like, it just always felt wrong. So a lot of it was just kind of tightening what I decided the parameters would be. Like, we wouldn't see a lot of her life before this, like no flashbacks, like no real information about her past. And almost like I got to this point where it was like, is this information about her giving, like, what happens if I take it away? Like, does this character still have like presence? And that, it was a lot about removal.
Yes.
Yeah. So the ending of this story, The Swimmer, I don't know if anyone has read it, but it just has always haunted me. It's one of the most terrifying endings. It's this man, kind of good-natured, drunk guy in Connecticut, and everything seems fine in his life, and everything's good, and he, decides to swim home through these backyard pools, and just ever so slightly things start changing and curdling, and friends start to look at you with like a new cast in their face, or there's just some sourness in the air, and he finally, gets home after this saga, and the season seems to have changed. Suddenly all the leaves have dropped off the trees, and he's home finally where his wife and children are. And he staggers up to his front door, and like the doors are locked and the house is completely abandoned and there's no one inside. And there's just something so terrifying about the idea of finding yourself adrift in your own life to such an extent where just the complete estrangement of self. And like the mysteriousness of that ending, like there's no explanation. Like, is this guy in a time warp? Like, what's happened? Just something about that like abject, miserable ending where you're backed up against like your worst self. I knew that that's where I wanted to leave the character. I I sort of played around with like, okay, are we going to leave it in a more, is the bow going to be tied a little more neatly around this ending? But I kept feeling for this character, it's like you kind of know it's not good. Like, nothing, there's no version of this character's life where things are going to go well. And I liked leaving her in that state of just, complete alienation from the self. And being confronted with all your bad decisions.
On the note of amorphous endings, we have to end our panel here. But I want to thank Emma so much for joining us.
Katy.